I just thought I would start by giving you my impressions, my first impressions of visiting Giza and seeing the Sphinx for the first time. I looked at it from afar. I looked at it from very close up. I walked around it. I tried to make eye contact with it. And I just couldn't figure out exactly what it was, because I'd heard about the Sphinx from my school days. I think most of us do, and we are told it is a leonine creature with the head of a human, probably a pharaoh. But to me it seemed not like a lion at all. It looked like my dog when she was guarding me while I was gardening. That is, couchant, on guard, with the front feet out, the straight back. And in my mind's eye, I thought I could even see pointed ears. And I also felt a sense of water, that I was in a watery place, or a place that had been watery. And when I talked to Robert about his first impressions, when we met at the rear end of the Sphinx finally, he had felt the same. So I'll just hand you over to him now.
Well, here we have the vision that we all have in our minds of the Sphinx, the immemorial statue surrounded by the sands of wild, deserted desert in Egypt. And this is what it was like in the 19th century. And it's one of my favorite photos, which I paid rather too much for. And so the first thing I think that we ought to get straight is that the story that we've all been told, that the nose was shot off the Sphinx by Napoleon's soldiers, is not true. In fact, a 14th century Arab historian called al-Makrizi, who's very famous to the Arabs, although I don't expect many English-speaking people have heard of him, describes what really happened. And Olivia has translated that from the only existing European translation of his Arabic work, which was in French, and so she's put it into English.
The Blessed Sheikh Mohammed Saim el-Deher of the Sufi order, from the monastery of El-Saleh, devised the plan to destroy some of the practices contrary to the law of Allah. We have seen this saintly person go to the pyramids, mutilate the figure of the Sphinx, and dispose of the pieces of it.
End of the first myth. So, the religious fanaticism is always with us. Every religion has the nutty ones. And unfortunately, there's been a bit of that at Giza, not just the Sphinx, but there's been damage inside the Great Pyramid, where the coffer inside the king's chamber up until the middle of the 19th century resounded just like a bell when you hit it with a hammer, which was there for all the tourists. And a local got very upset and knocked the corner off, which destroyed the harmonic resonant features of the coffer so that it doesn't resound like a bell anymore. And in my next book, Egyptian Dawn, I describe some other even more terrible damage that's been done underground in the Osiris shaft, which has been unbelievably mutilated sometime since 1946. But that's another story. So here we have the Sphinx as we imagine it, and this is not so easy to see unless you're staying illegitimately after dark in Giza, where they try to chase you out. But it's a very romantic sight, and it still is. Now, we've done some work in Egypt with the permission of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, as they call themselves, and we had special access to the Sphinx Temple in front of it and the Valley Temple, which is next to the Sphinx Temple, and I'm shooting from the top, the roof of the Valley Temple, hanging over the edge at great peril to life and limb, to get this shot that nobody's ever seen before of what the Sphinx looks like from that angle.
It's very dangerous to let Robert have special access to anywhere, because he's incredibly disobedient and pig-headed, and once he sees something that attracts him, like a shaft or a hole or a wobbly door, that's it. And I'm the one that gets left with the guards who say it is time to go.
Yeah. She's great at keeping them busy with chat while I'm doing forbidden things. Now, as Olivia said, one of the first things that we wondered about when we very first saw the Sphinx is very clearly seen here. It's very difficult to get a good view of the Sphinx from a distance to get the proportions, but this shot shows it very well. You can see that the head is like a pimple on top of this giant statue the size of an ocean liner. And we all know that the Egyptians were very keen on getting everything in correct proportion. So why would they carve the largest stone statue in the world and get the proportions wrong? It's just not what they would do. So we knew something was wrong. Also, you can see there's not really anything remotely resembling a lion there. But we'll come to that in a moment. I want to show you more shots to show you how out of proportion the head is to the body. This is a wonderful aerial shot, and you can see the tiny weeny head, just like a pimple. I just think of it as a pimple. Maybe it's an adolescent. Here we are again with pimple head. It's just not right. They would never have done that. And here we are with pimple head again. They're trying to make him look more beautiful. But what they call restoration in Egypt is worse than all the Botox of Hollywood combined. Now, here we have a wonderful shot taken from a balloon by a gal called Marilyn Bridges. And this, I may show this again when we come back to talk about all the water aspects. You can see the Sphinx temple directly in front of the Sphinx there. It was not known until 1936 when it was excavated. Before that, it was covered in a mound of sand ever since 2000 BC. So it's remarkably preserved. Well, I mean, it's ruined, but preserved ruin, a bit like myself. And the temple on the left is called the Valley Temple. Now, the corridor between them is very important, as you'll discover as we go along. Now, this is what it looked like in 1610. And I think this is a very jolly picture. I actually bought the book that this is in and had it scanned. And we did a lot to try to bring the contrast out to make a decent picture of this old woodcut, which is based on a drawing.
And apparently some of the early travelers tell of the Arabs pirouetting with their horses on the back of the Sphinx, which was just a tiny little ridge in the sand.
And you can see the jolly chaps with what they called harquebuses over their shoulders. I love the word harquebus. It sounds so much more glamorous than rifle. And this is what the people saw at the time of Napoleon. And as you can see, that nose is already gone. So, lions, the body of the Sphinx. This is a collection of lions which are excavated from the tomb of King Jur, who was not a jerk, but he was a Jur, of the first dynasty. Now, these are traditional lion shapes. Do they look anything like the Sphinx to you? I'll let you answer that question to yourselves. Here's another first dynasty. Well, no, this is a later lion, but in fact, this lion was excavated in the precincts of the Sphinx, in what they call the Sphinx pit. Probably New Kingdom, this one. Now, this is a typical example of the proportion grid used by the ancient Egyptians to do all their statuary. And you can see that they had worked out exactly what a lion was supposed to be like. They used these grids because when you have it all marked out in squares like that, you use a small one to do a big one because you just multiply all the measurements and it all comes out the same. And here's another first dynasty Sphinx, a lion drawn from the an ivory label found in another First Dynasty tomb. And this is the complete label. And there's the chap sitting in there in his little cubicle. And there he is running, doing the Heb Set festival, which was a rejuvenation festival to the right at the top, and all kinds of funny things going on. And behind him is his name with the Horus falcon on top. Now here's another, this is another New Kingdom lion.
That's the face, just the nose there.
So you see, lions were very conventionally represented in Egypt, and they don't look anything like the Sphinx. Now, a great friend of most of yours who lives right here in Glastonbury and who I can see hiding over there, Daoud Sutton, is the man I want to thank very heartily indeed for coming up with this brilliant drawing which shows what we believe the Sphinx originally was. There's the Sphinx superimposed upon what we believe it was, which was a giant statue of the crouching Anubis, the guard dog. And he was the traditional guardian of the necropolis throughout the whole of Egyptian history for thousands of years. And at the end of the Old Kingdom, when civilization collapsed for about 150 years in what they call the First Intermediate Period, which is a very mild term for a violent time, mobs are known to have rampaged around Giza, smashing everything they could get their hands on, including all the statues of Khephren, for instance, and all the archaeologists agree that this happened. And so we've decided to extend the scenario as to what they smashed, not just in the Valley Temple next door to the Sphinx, but the Sphinx itself would probably have been damaged. And it's quite easy to knock the pointy ears and pointy nose off of an Anubis statue if you're really determined to do so. And so we think that they were predecessors to Sheikh Mohammed, who people have been having a go at the head of that statue for a long time. This is the famous Anubis that was found in the tomb of King Tutankhamun. And this is his traditional pose, which is, as you will recognize, the pose of the Sphinx. Here's another New Kingdom wall carving from the temple, I believe it's the temple of Seti I at Abydos. And here, this is a picture I took of a carving in granite at Karnak, which was sitting out in the yard because it was a fragment of something. And this is King Jurgen. There he is. He's getting around. He's keen on dogs and lions. This is one of the earliest representations of Anubis from the First Dynasty. He's got a very long tail. He often did. And in our book, it's explained in detail. I'll just pass over it here, that in prehistoric Egypt, they had these huge Anubis shrines, which were in the shape of Anubis, and where it was a sacred building, and you went in there for whatever rituals they were doing, probably death rituals of some kind, or embalming. And these were large structures, in other words, big dogs. So I think that these are the prototypes of what eventually came to be carved in stone. These big Anubises then became the biggest of Anubis of all, the Sphinx. And here is a restored version of an Anubis hut seen, because those were old pictures before. This is a modern reconstruction by Alexander Badawi to show more clearly what they were like. So now this brings us to what the Sphinx looks like today. And I think that we all ought to take note of the fact that it was very severely damaged before. And you can see these things on the side are called lappets, because the headdress is known as the Nemes headdress, which was a religious headgear made of starched linen, apparently, and colored blue and yellow, which was worn only by the pharaoh at very specific, important religious ceremonies. And it was to do with the resurrection cult. And they've been broken off. But in 1926 to 36, they were restored with all this modern concrete, which you can very clearly see here. And a lot of holes were filled in with modern cement So, and holes and gashes in the face and all sorts, you can see that it's a very, very Botoxed Sphinx indeed.
And it used to have a pink face, rosy face.
Yes, in the New Kingdom,
Terracotta colour.
they painted the face red. In fact, it was very garish because there's a hole in the head, an early form of trepanning perhaps. And they stuck a pole down there with banners and things. And it was, I don't think any of us who like soft, subtle pastel shades would have been very impressed by the Sphinx in the New Kingdom period, because it was a very garish, seriously over-the-top idol. It had been turned into an idol. By that time, of course, it had the human head. And this is a view that people don't normally see, looking at it from inside the Sphinx temple. Now, whose face is on the Sphinx? Do you notice any resemblance? I believe I've identified the person whose face is on the Sphinx as the third pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, which is a period known as the Middle Kingdom, and his name was Amenemhet II. In the back of the book, you will find a translation, translated with most immense difficulty from German, by a very long-winded archaeologist called Ludwig Borchardt, and he published this, I think it was 1895 or 8, this article called On the Age of the Sphinx at Giza. Now, you need to remember that he did this before the Sphinx was properly excavated, so he was only talking about the face and head. He did the most brilliant analysis, pointing out that all those stripes on the lappets and the eye paint stripes on the face and so on, only were things that were found, those particular styles, in the Middle Kingdom period. Not in the Old Kingdom, not in the New Kingdom. And in fact, only in a certain portion of the Middle Kingdom. And he decided that this proved that the Sphinx was of Middle Kingdom date. Well, then they went and excavated it, and everybody said, "You must be joking, Ludwig Borchardt's folly." And everybody laughed and said, "Oh, it's the stupidest thing he ever published," and he never got over the disgrace of it. But I believe that he was actually correct about the head. What nobody's ever thought of amongst the Egyptologists, or indeed anyone else, was that you can date the head at a different date than the body because it's not the original head. You see, nobody put that together. Once you realize that it's a recarved head, okay, the head was recarved in the Middle Kingdom, and it was recarved by Amenemhet II, this man who looks really just like the Sphinx, and wasn't a bad-looking guy, actually. And he had to do something because there was the Sphinx sitting there with just a stump instead of a head. And so he said, "Well, we'll put a face on it." "Well, whose face should that be, Your Majesty?" He wasn't shy. And this is in the Louvre. This is him in the Louvre. He was taken captive by the French. Still being held for ransom, but the Egyptians hadn't paid up. So here's another view of the Sphinx from the top of the Valley Temple, and it shows the Khephren Causeway going right up to the Pyramid of Khephren. And so now I'm going to talk about the water and the Sphinx and the business of erosion. The Sphinx used to look like this. You can see here, and also there, if you look at the body closely, that there appear to be signs of what really looks like water erosion. The first person to mention it was Shrouded in 1961, just in passing. He pointed out the erosion on the body of the Sphinx looked like water erosion. Nobody paid much attention until John Anthony West, followed by Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock, began to make a big fuss about that, and they brought in a geologist called Robert Schoch, who also made a big fuss about that. And they were very correct, in my opinion, to say that there are signs, unmistakable signs, of water erosion, not only on the Sphinx, but on the walls of the Sphinx pit as well. So here we have a nice shot from the top of the Great Pyramid. It's double because it's one of those slides that you look at, you know, where you get 3D. And where's the pointer?
Stereoscope thing, isn't it?
Yeah, stereo viewer. I don't know actually how to work this.
Press this little thing just here. You do it, because I'm trying to sort it out in the brain.
So here we are. Where's the Sphinx? He's there somewhere. There he is. That's the Sphinx. You see the Sphinx temple is still invisible, but the Valley Temple is known. And there's the Sphinx. Just a nice view from the top of the Great Pyramid. Most people don't normally see that. And there's a wonderful shot taken by the RAF, which I bought on eBay, believe it or not. And you can see, this is pre-1936, that the Sphinx temple is underneath this great mound of sand and completely unknown. And even though the Sphinx body has been completely excavated in 1926 by Emile Barrez, this is between 26 and 36, this photo. And it was only in 36, when Salim Hassan was excavating further, that he suddenly discovered this temple was underneath this huge mountain of sand. And here we have a plan showing the two temples and the Sphinx, as they are now known. And here we have this view again from the air, which shows all the structures clearly from above. And in fact, if I can have the pointer, these are, it's very important to notice that these are keys. It was the Nile, before the Aswan Dam was built, there was the annual inundation of the Nile. And for 3 months of the year, the water flooded everything. I'm sure you all know that. And then it receded for 9 months. And then it left all that silt behind, and everybody had great crops and so forth. Well, in the Old Kingdom times, it came right up to here in the inundation, the flood. And in fact, in the 17th century, Richard Pocock describes it as being only 660 yards away from there at the inundation, somewhere down here. And in fact, I worked out that a good sprinter could run from the Sphinx Temple to the Nile in 22 seconds. That was in the 17th century when people were stronger. Now, this is very important for understanding what I believe is the true explanation for the erosion at the Sphinx. We do not believe in what has come to be known as the ancient rain theory. That was a bold and worthy attempt to explain the apparently inexplicable. However, there is a simpler explanation for which there is a considerable degree of evidence, and it avoids the necessity for postulating 7,000 years of total lack of any archaeological artifacts in the ground in between the ancient rain and when prehistoric Egypt starts to leave bits and pieces which have been excavated. So we have this alternative theory for the indisputable erosion. Now here is the wall of the Sphinx pit, and you can see that there are these vertical crevices which apparently show vertical water erosion. That's very important. And the water erosion on the Sphinx itself is only horizontal. How you get horizontal erosion on the Sphinx, but vertical erosion on the wall, that's an important point. And it's important evidence that indicates that our alternative explanation is more reliable than the ancient rain theory. And you can see also the horizontal erosion. That's due to the different layers of the limestone. That's not actually perfectly horizontal. It's a bit at a slant because the whole bedrock is at a slant. And so that's the water eating away at the weak bits, and which are the streaks that are horizontal streaks, and then the stronger bits are the lumpy bits that are still sticking out. You see, that's the other thing that's wrong with the Sphinx. When we first saw it, we thought, if you've carved the largest stone statue in the world, why would you hide it in a hole in the ground? Would you do that? You'd want to flaunt it, wouldn't you? Say, hey, we've got the largest stone statue in the world. Come and see. And you take your friend along to see the largest stone statue in the world, and he says, where is it? Oh, it's down in that hole in the ground there. Is that where you would put something the size of an ocean liner that you'd taken a great deal of trouble to carve out of the bedrock? No. You'd want to have it on a high place, a hill, or at least have it at ground level. Why isn't the Sphinx up where all those people are? Why is it in a pit? What is it doing in a hole in the ground? Well, we figured that one out, we think. So here's Olivia attempting to climb up one of these vertical crevices, and you can see just how deeply they are gouged out of the rock. And she's there not just to look attractive, but also for scale. And yeah. I'm not completely reformed. So here's another view of the Sphinx pit, as it's called, but we call it the Sphinx moat, because we believe that it was filled with water brought in from the Nile when it was an inundation. And it was brought in this corridor just here between the two temples, this bit. And we're going to see that much more closely in a moment. And it was then shut in by sluice gates, and I will show you the evidence of the sluice gates, because tourists aren't allowed there, but we had this special permission because we were doing a different archaeological project to do with dating the two temples, which we're still working on all that. That's not in this book, it's in another one to come. And so the water filled what they call the pit and became the moat. Now that's very, very, very important in terms of ancient textual evidence. But here we see more what it was like in the pit, looking down. And this was what was going on in 1936 with all the attempt to tidy the Sphinx up, to add the bits of concrete, to smear cement into all the holes and make it look tidy for tourism. And we're going to come back to that when we come to talk about all the chambers, the secret chambers. And you can see how fantastically eroded the rear was until they started putting blocks of stone over the top to make it look neat. And I had a lot of trouble collecting all these photos of the restoration in 36 because they're not easily available. So now, here we come to the evidence of the corridor between the two temples where I believe that the water was let into the moat and then closed in and sealed in with the sluice gates and kept there for 9 months until the next inundation. And the simple water-raising machinery to bring it up that slight level was very, very easy. No problem at all to raise the water slightly and to get it to come in. Now, you can see, I need to explain what this is. This is the north wall of the Valley Temple. And here we see the beginning of the Sphinx Temple. So this is the corridor that leads from where the Nile was, which is down at that end, into the Sphinx moat, which is sort of down here. And you can see very clearly that these are, now you have to remember that this was covered in sand since 2000 BC until 1936. So nobody tampered with this after 2000 BC. This is an indentation cut in the stone of the wall of the temple for what I believe was a sliding counterweight as part of the sluice gates and water gates that retained all this water in the moat. And here we have the various traces of bolt holes and so on. And I've got a lot more of these pictures for you to see more clearly. Here's this counterweight slot that I mentioned, looked at from another angle. And here are traces of bolt holes. Now, why would they be there if not for a purpose? You know, you've got a wall of a sacred temple and you're carving this strange slot in it. And that's a lot of work, and you're also tampering with a sacred precinct. You would only do that for a very good reason. And it is, in my opinion, certainly a counterweight to do with raising and lowering the sluice gate. Here we have another shot to see just how deep these bolt holes really were and how many of them there were. And this is the counterweight slot. This is the Sphinx moat here, and there's the counterweight slot and the bolt holes. And there are some steps here. These are ancient steps. This is for maintenance and so on, and when it was constructed and whatever. And here we have tourists standing on what's the beginning of the Kefren Causeway, going up towards the temple. Now, look at this. It's this part here. Imagine all the water rushing in from the Nile, coming into the moat. It's going to strike it with force, and you can see that it's created this swirling pattern from repeated rushings. Because, you know, they had it as a moat for 400 or 500 years or so, and they were doing this at least once a year. And so it's creating this swirling pattern in the bedrock as it comes rushing in and spilling out into the moat. Here you see it again. It's doing that to the rock. Now that's not rain, that's onrushing water that's coming in, striking that, and going off to the right, swirling off to the right into the moat. Now this is a little thing carved out of the rock. The Valley Temple is up here. You can see a tourist's foot there. And this is the corridor going like this. The Sphinx moat is off here. And this very interesting thing is, this is a step carved in the stone, in the rock. And I believe that they had a little boat that came in here. And this was an entrance from the causeway down into the moat. Here's another view of it. You can see these are modern stones that have just been jammed in there while they put this thing to stop the tourists falling down. But this has been very carefully carved out of the bedrock in this little cubicle, which was certainly, in my opinion, an access to the moat from the temple. Now, this is taken from inside the Sphinx temple, which I believe was also flooded periodically, and that the Sphinx temple itself was partially underwater during the inundation. And here you can see what's very clearly, to my eye, very severe water erosion of one of the columns inside the Sphinx temple itself. Now, the wall of the Sphinx temple that's on the Sphinx side, the bottom of it is carved up out of the bedrock, a point which is never mentioned by any of the archaeologists, by the way. And the rest of it forms the other barrier. You see, the Sphinx moat, there are cliffs on three sides, and the front, which is the eastern side, is this wall, half of which is the bedrock, which was carved as a wall, and then they put stones on top to double the height. And in that very wall, there are remains of a little tiny landing stage for another small boat to go into this moat as part of what I believe to have been the religious ceremonies that took place there. Now, here, this is inside the Sphinx temple. I believe that this was, well, they call it a magazine. There are two of them. And I believe that it's where they stored the boats, one of the boats, in the dry period. And that's the explanation here. They were walking around the edge, and this is for the bottom of the boat, which is deeper than where you have to walk. And this is all solid bedrock here, and this is solid bedrock, and these are stones laid on top. And this is the end of the Sphinx temple that's in front of the Sphinx. And here's this aerial view again, so that you can appreciate more what I've just been showing you. We were looking just here. The water-eroded column is here. The magazine is here. And just here, directly in front of the Sphinx's head, is a small landing stage just surviving in the stone wall there. The bottom of this wall is bedrock, so that when they carved the Sphinx, they also carved a wall in front of it, out of the bedrock. Why would they do that? Now, you have to bear in mind that if the Sphinx was being worshipped as like an idol, as it was in the New Kingdom onwards, you would have some means of communication between the temple, where it would be presumably worshipped, and the idol itself. But there is no communication. There is no way to get from this temple to the Sphinx. There's no door, there's no window, there's nothing. The only thing is there's a landing stage on top of the wall that looks as if it's going down into a moat, you see? how can you worship that idol from that temple when you can't get to it? And you can't get to it from here either, except through that little niche I showed you, which is here. Now, I believe that this was full of water, and that because it was Anubis, that lake is the lake that's mentioned repeatedly in the pyramid texts, which is called Jackal Lake. And it had other names as well, the Winding Waterway, and I believe that they went in a little boat round as part of ceremonies. Now, Egyptologists are always saying the Sphinx is never mentioned in the ancient texts. Why is that? You've got this great statue, and they never talk about it. What's wrong with them, they say. Well, it's not what's wrong with the Egyptians, it's what's wrong with the Egyptologists that they should be asking about, because the reason it's not mentioned is because it was never a lion with a man's head. And they're looking for a lion with a man's head, and that's just not what it was. As soon as you realize that it was Anubis, it's mentioned over and over and over and over again. They talk about the giant Anubis at Rostau at Giza. They talk about it being, twice they mention it being beside a causeway. They say it's guarding the gates of the dead, it's guarding the necropolis, and it's Anubis on his hill. And of course, the hill is the Giza plateau. And all of the descriptions of Anubis that you find in the pyramid texts perfectly match the idea that this is Anubis, or was Anubis. And this is where special ceremonies were held to do with a resurrection cult, because when the pharaoh died and he was being embalmed, which took 70 days, what they call a slow cook, the son of the pharaoh had to carry out special ceremonies because the first thing you do when you're being embalmed is your internal organs are removed and put into 4 jars. And the ceremonies are described in the pyramid texts, and the son of the pharaoh, who's the new pharaoh, of course, has to wash his father's organs in their jars by submerging them in the sacred Jackal Lake. Well, this is where he did it. That's what he was doing, standing there, getting down into a little boat, and going around in a ceremony, and he would dip the jars with his father's internal organs into the Jackal Lake and purify them by washing them in this sacred lake as part of the ceremony to enable him to be purified sufficiently to be resurrected. And because every pharaoh wanted to be resurrected and become what they called an Ak, which means a glorified spirit. And so all of these ceremonies of purification were taking place here in this lake in the Old Kingdom period. And this is the corridor where the water was let through. This is the front where you can see these keys. Well, there's more here, which were visible in the aerial photo, but have since been covered over by sand again. And this is the corridor, and this is the Sphinx moat, and here are the front of the paws, which have been repeatedly restored. Even in Roman times, they were trying to make them look like lion's paws. We've got no idea what the paws looked like originally, because they're so totally eroded underneath all the renewal stones. And this is the beginning of the Kefren Causeway. Now, unmarked here on this plan is this little place where you step down. Now, I've translated the excavation report by Ricky of this temple into English, and similarly I've translated the excavation report from German into English of this other one here, which is much longer and more difficult, by Hölscher, and they're discussed in my next book, because we've done a lot of work in these 2 temples and made many amazing discoveries about these 2 structures. But this book is just about the Sphinx, and it's this is the corridor where the water was let in. The sluice gates were here, you see, to block it in. And that's where the swirling pattern is found, where the water is hitting that and rushing in. And here are some pictures of the inundation in the old days, and how you can see that the water's right up there near the pyramids. This is after it's receded. This is what's left after the inundation in the 19th century, but you can see how close the water was. But it was actually coming right up to the base here of the pyramid. But round here, this dips down and becomes where the Sphinx is, so that the water can reach it. Now, we come to the question of chambers. And everybody wants to know, is there a chamber beneath the Sphinx, and better still, a secret chamber. In fact, there are several chambers. This is one which anybody who has access to the Sphinx pit can see for himself, but of course you have to be an incredibly difficult person like myself to actually lift the lid when nobody's looking and have a peek. This is between the paws of the Sphinx. There is a chamber down here, and this is a modern iron covering so that the people who pay extra to go in there don't fall down and break their necks and sue the Egyptian government. A lot of luck there. And this was discovered in 1817 when Caviglia excavated the front of the Sphinx. And very strange things happened because a man called Henry Salt was the British consul in Cairo at the time. He was a bit of an oddball, but then most of us are who take an interest in these things. I'm sure we're all oddballs or we wouldn't be here today, which is good. That's good. We like being odd, don't we? I always have been since I was born. And this chamber, which is a small chamber where you can crouch, may have been the one from which the oracles were delivered, which are later reported as having been delivered by the Sphinx in the Greek and Roman times and the New Kingdom times, and subsequently. But it led somewhere else. There was a passage, if you go down in there, there's a passage that leads out of it, which was blocked up by Henry Salt in 1817. And a French chap called the Count de Forbin severely criticized Salt for blocking up not just that, but other passages and openings in and around the Sphinx. And we're going to see more of them. But this is something that anybody can find. But you won't find it mentioned in the books that talk about the Sphinx, even though it's right there in plain sight, that there's this chamber beneath this, the floor of the Sphinx moat between the paws. And this is where it is. It's in this area here. And these are some chaps having a very nice time. This is the old Roman stones, which are now completely covered over again, of the attempt to restore the paws. Now, Olivia is going to read a few descriptions of chambers to do with the Sphinx. And the back of our book consists of every description of the Sphinx ever published since Pliny in the 1st century AD, the Roman chap, up until 1837 when we got too exhausted to go on. And most of the stuff was not published in English, and I translated the German things, and Olivia translated all the French stuff, which was a huge, huge job, and she's going to read a few excerpts.
Did you say that we found 281 years of published eyewitness accounts of a burial chamber beneath the Sphinx? Anyway, this is...
I'll hold this.
Yeah, Christopher Führer von Hemmendorf, 1565. A large sphinx which was used for giving oracles. In front of the pyramids, in the direction of the city of Cairo, stands a very large sphinx cut out of the rock, so much covered by wind-blown sand on its lower part that only the head, breast, and back protrude. An immensely large creature. It has on its right side, in its flank, a quadrangular hole, through which, as we were informed, in olden days, one could go inside and could ascend into the head. Inside there, the priests spoke, which the Egyptians took for oracles. That's one. And then this is by Johann Helfrich, 1565. He says, the following day we left... Oh, sorry, I wasn't going to read this, actually. I mean, it's interesting, but it isn't about a chamber. I'll leave that one.
This
one is the end of it, by that fellow. This image, the statue, is entirely hollow on the inside, and one can enter it underground from a distance by means of a narrow passage made of stone, through which one can pass secretly. By means of this passage, the heathen priests entered the head and spoke to the people, making announcements by the babbling of the head or else the effigy did this by its own means.
Babbling.
Then there's a little one here from Seigneur de Viamont, 1590, from a voyage en Egypte. It is said that in ancient times it was an oracle that gave responses to the Egyptians for the questions that they asked it at sunrise. Interesting that they asked it at sunrise. Then I think that might be it actually. Let me just see. Well, there's a little tiny one here this is by Prosper Alpinus from 1581 to 1584. He says that I tend to believe that it was an ornament placed on his sepulchre, for in the rear one finds a subterranean vault hollowed out of the hard rock, which in all likelihood was a tomb. That's in the rear rather than in the head.
And that was 1581.
I think I'll leave it at that.
All of these accounts are in the back of the book. And we found 281 years' worth of published eyewitness accounts of people who actually saw a burial chamber beneath the Sphinx. Now, I'm not referring to what we call the rump tunnel and the little chamber that's carved out of the bedrock there, which most of you who know anything about the Sphinx have heard of, which is just like something scooped that a couple of people could stand in. It's certainly not a burial chamber. And I'll show that to you. There's a chap standing on the head.
That's a wonderful picture.
Now, I will come back to the thing at the rump in a moment. This is in the left flank, behind the left front shoulder of the Sphinx. This was blocked up in 1926 by Émile Barrès. It was a doorway, and there's a chamber in there, just here in the Sphinx, which goes down below the ground level. And here's Olivia standing there for scale. Those are old blocks which Barrès in 1926, when he excavated the thing, took and filled in and used cement to cement into place this hole because he thought it was unaesthetic. But of course, it was one of the many ways inside the Sphinx, which we could easily unblock if anybody had the will to do so. Now, here is what we call the rump tunnel. This is the Sphinx's bum, and this is looking down from above. This is getting a lot closer. That's a modern iron bar for support. And those stones at the top are modern limestone pieces that have been stuck there over the eroded bits to try and make it look pretty. And below is the bedrock. And this is me being very nosy.
Well, you want me to speak?
Yes.
What more can one say? I nearly left you there forever. And you might have been found, a little vertebrae thing, in 1,000 years' time. But in fact, we weren't supposed to be going down that aperture, and it was extremely nerve-wracking because there were guards circling round, and I was seriously worried Robert might be shot in the bum.
Well, so I did survive. And I like to say this is a picture of me with my head sticking out of the Sphinx's ass.
You can see what a small space it is to squeeze through, though.
A certain type of American could not get in there. Now, this is what it looks like inside. You can see all the rubbish is blown in. And this is the this is the bottom of a modern metal ladder that they've jammed in there, and this is that metal strut that you saw. And you're looking straight down. This is the bedrock, and this has been carved out of the bedrock, basically scooped out of the bedrock, not with any great skill. At some later date, this is not original with the Sphinx. And there's a space down here full of rubbish where two people could stand side by side. And I believe it's where people slept overnight to get a sacred dream. And during the Greek and Roman period, it was used for what they call incubation. You sleep there overnight, and they believe the goddess Isis came to heal them or give them some inspiration. Now, if you look up, and this is never mentioned by anyone, above that is another tunnel. And it goes up and turns left and goes along inside the Sphinx under the right rump up above. And it's only 1 stone thick to the outside. Now, I tried to climb along in there, and then these wooden struts started to collapse, and they're obviously holding the Sphinx up. I sometimes feel that I need to be held up myself, but not to that extent.
And what were they doing? They must have been, somebody must have been looking at what was in there, or they wouldn't have had the struts there.
It's when they restored it in the late 70s, they realized that they didn't put struts in there, the whole thing was going to fall in. And I'm sorry to have to say this, but I didn't wish to die for science on that particular day. So I didn't go along the tunnel, but I do know that it stops when it reaches the hips. And at that point, it's filled with cement by the inevitable Barres in 1926. Now here is where the tunnel goes. This is the rump where the scoop is. And that rising tunnel comes and goes around here and ends here. This blob is modern concrete and cement put there in 1926 by Barres. Now, look at this crack in the bedrock here. This is very important because the accounts that we found of the burial chamber, which is not the same as this at all, describe precisely where it was, because the various people, the eyewitnesses, measured it. They measured, there was a rectangular opening here with a vertical shaft that went straight down at this point. And they measured its distance from the head, and they measured its distance from the rump, and we know exactly where it was, and it was here. This blob in 1926 of concrete filled the vertical shaft that leads to the burial chamber, which is directly below here. And the descriptions, which were all given in the book, word for word, describe it, and it had been robbed in antiquity. There were the remains of a coffin in there, and the walls had hieroglyphic inscriptions on them. So if we could get back in there, we could read what the hieroglyphs say, and we'd know what was going on. Now, my theory about it is that it was a later intruded burial. I don't know when, but long after the Old Kingdom period. But it would have had to be a royal burial, and it may be the king Amasis, who Pliny says was buried beneath the Sphinx, who was a 26th dynasty, Side king. And they were obsessed with Giza in those days, so it may be his tomb. And although we'll never be able to get all that concrete out without destroying one of Egypt's major tourist attractions, we could get at the place by going down here or down here and in from the ground. And you can see that this crack came about in the bedrock with the force of driving down that shaft and creating the chamber. I believe there are actually 2 chambers there. This burial area shattered the bedrock with the force of its intrusion and construction. So this is the true secret chamber beneath the Sphinx, the burial chamber that everybody's always been looking for. It's been known all along. 281 years worth of published eyewitness accounts which nobody had noticed, which I had to go dig out of the libraries because everybody else was just too lazy. Now, the intruded shaft eventually caused a weakness to develop in the Sphinx, and this rump actually fragmented here. We believe this happened after a chap called Murad Bey had a go at reconstructing and excavating, which was just before Napoleon's troops arrived. They also had a go. And so we believe it was at the time, about 1750 to 1800, that this split off. And that was weakened because that's where the shaft was driven down, to this burial chamber. But there's no trace of that crack now. And this has been filled up with modern cement as well, this week's spot. And you can see how those concrete bits were not there at that time on the lappets. And this split bit here, that's exactly where the shaft is. Now here is where, Olivia read that account by the chap in 1565 saying that there was a hole beneath, in the right flank, into which you could enter the Sphinx. And I've already showed you the photos of where the hole is on the left flank where you could get in. And this box here has been constructed at some unknown date in front of the entrance beside here that's under the right shoulder. So you see the Sphinx is simply riddled with chambers and tunnels inside and beneath. And here's a closer view of that thing. Nobody ever pays any attention to it. What was it? Why is it that nobody ever asks these questions? There it is again. Now, we do know that there was once meant to be a very tall statue beside the Sphinx of Osiris, and this may have been its base. Who knows what's really going on? But it's blocking up an entrance here to yet another chamber inside the Sphinx. Here's another one. There are 4 of these lumps on the Sphinx, and this is also on the right side of the Sphinx, the south side, a smaller one than the one we've just seen. What is this all about? And there's 2 on the other side. There's 4 of these. And are they blocking what used to be entrances used for people to crawl around on the inside of the statue?
Do you know how old the blocks are? Some of them are obviously modern, but what about those curved ones?
Well, the modern ones are clearly at the top, and that's obviously modern as well. But these are very old stones, certainly, but they're not very finished, and this is a bit of a botched job. This is not original, and this would have been maybe done by the Greeks or the Romans.
The Romans used smaller blocks, didn't they?
Yes, the Romans used those tiny blocks that we saw on the Sphinx's paws with all those chaps standing around it. Now, this is just one photo I've taken beneath the Giza plateau to show you the inside of the Osiris shaft, bottom chamber, which is an island which was the simulation of the tomb of Osiris. And this is the canal. This has got scum on top of it, a sort of strange limestone scum, but it's perfectly clear water underneath. And it's a rectangular island here, and this water goes all around it, and there's a granite sarcophagus in the middle. And this is the bottom of the Osiris shaft. And I'm just showing you that to show you that there was another island at Giza. Those of you who have read Herodotus know that he mentioned an underground island, and this is an underground island. And this is a kind of subterranean version of the Jackal Lake, you might say, but instead of having Anubis in the middle, it's got the tomb of Osiris in the middle.
It's like as above, so below, the reflection.
Very much so, absolutely. And those of you who are really keen on these things will know that there's a bigger version of this at Abydos, at the Osirian, behind the Temple of Seti I. And I describe much more about the Osiris shaft in the forthcoming book called Egyptian Dawn. Now, this is another one of the great artistic productions of Daoud Sutton, your local geometer. And this is the 3 pyramids at Giza and the Sphinx. This is the Great Pyramid, that's the Pyramid of Khephren, and this is the Little Pyramid of Mycerinus. And this is the Sphinx, with the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple. And this is the Khephren Causeway along here. And what I was able to discover, this is very important, the final 2 chapters of the Sphinx mystery are all about geometry and the symbolism of resurrection and the golden angle, which is to do with the golden section, which was something that the Egyptians were obsessed by. And all of these key points, here's the apex of each of the pyramids, and here are these key points and these central points of the sides of the base here. They have what I call rays shooting out, that is sighting lines, which are all at the golden angle. So this is a golden angle, that's 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 a golden angle. These are all golden angles. That's a golden angle, that's a golden angle. It goes on and on and on and on. It gets very boring in the end, and they were clearly obsessive compulsives when it came to golden angles. But the point of all this is not just that these pyramids are all related to each other by all these angles from all the key points of all these rays shooting between the key points, which has never been discovered before. But so is the Sphinx. The Sphinx is rigidly positioned here. Its midpoint and its left front and its right rear are on rays shooting from these key points of the Great Pyramid, and joined by rays from, see, the midpoint is joined to that point, and a ray to that point. So there, and that makes a golden angle in itself with this east-west line, and then they join in the midpoint, and the Sphinx's position and size are rigidly fixed by golden angles, and what this proves is that the three main pyramids in the Sphinx constitute a unitary design concept, that they were all designed and presumably constructed at the same time. And therefore, this means that the so-called King's Tomb theory doesn't stand up, because the way the Egyptologists like to say it is Cheops decided he wanted a big tomb for himself, so he built the Great Pyramid. Khephren came along. He was running out of rock or something, and he built a slightly smaller tomb for himself, but there was a pharaoh in between, which people don't normally mention. And then there was another pharaoh in between, and then along comes Mycerinus or Menkaure, and he's really running out of steam, so he builds this tiny little one here for his tomb. And this happened progressively over a period of time, almost by whimsy, and there was no connection between these things. But that's just can't be true, because if you analyze it by golden angles, you find it's a unitary concept. Now, what it means is another matter to be taken up at some point. I am just trying to establish that there is a pattern. Why there's a pattern, that's another matter. But it's unquestionably something to do with the resurrection cult, because with other things which I can't take time to show you, but which are in the book, we know that the golden angle was the angle of resurrection, and there's 2 long chapters explaining all of that with lots of pictures. Now, if you want to see the pictures in color, because the book is published entirely in sepia, which is fine for the old archive photos, the full color are on the website, which is sphinxmystery.info, which will come up here in a second, which you should all go to. It's free. It's meant to supplement the book. It will appear here momentarily by magic. You see that my wand did that. Sphinxmystery.info, and all the modern photos are there in full color to fill your computer screen, so that you're not stuck only with the sepia versions of them. Although I think the old pictures look great in sepia. And here is, to close, is this shot from the Valley Temple roof showing the causeway going up there, and what was once a moat. And just imagine the pharaoh in his little boat and going around and washing his father's entrails, and maybe slightly gory, but that's what they did. But the pharaohs were chiefly interested in resurrection. The entire religion was based on resurrection. Anubis was part of a resurrection cult. These temples were about resurrection. The pyramids were about resurrection. And the golden angle was the angle of resurrection. And that's what it was all about. And the Egyptians were trying to tell us, who come later, what they deeply believed, which is there is a spiritual dimension to reality, and that we survive death, and that if we are good, we become what they called glorified spirits. And in great detail in the book, in the last chapters, I describe what they say happened to the bad guys, which is pretty bad, worse than anything you've heard. And if you like gory things, you can read all about what happens to the damned and all the people you don't like. So that's the end of our talk, and I don't know how much time we have, if there are any questions. Do we have any? We're allowed 2 questions, and there's one over there.
I've got a question about the microphone, please.
Stand here.
Right. I really like the idea of a moated sphinx. I'm just a bit curious about the question of water levels. Firstly, wouldn't the water have flooded any chambers and passages underneath the structure? And secondly, you were suggesting that water erosion had occurred quite high up on the body. Wouldn't, if the water was that high, and to me that would only make sense at in a period of decay or something, when it was over flooded or whatever. If the water was anything like that high, it would completely cover all the pores and sort of destroy the proportions of the statue. The moat makes perfect sense, but only with perhaps 3 or 4 feet of water in it. Literally just enough to float the boat and set the statue off. A higher water level, as I say, to create erosion at a higher level. That doesn't make any sense to me.
I'm very, very glad you've reminded me that I forgot to tell you one of the most crucial things I meant to say, which was, why is there the vertical erosion on the sides? The thing is that the wind-blown sand is coming in the whole time and threatening to fill the moat. So they have to dredge it the whole time. And as you know, when you dredge things and get the sand out, all the water pours down with great force. And that's what would have scoured out the vertical crevices. I forgot to mention that. That's key. So you get horizontal erosion on the Sphinx because the water level is rising and falling, but you get the vertical erosion because they're constantly having to dredge this moat. And all this water is just pouring down, and scouring out these vertical fissures.
It wasn't the horizontal erosion above the level of the pores.
Oh, yes, the pores would have been covered.
Where the back of the Sphinx was very badly eroded, right on its rump, really high up, and that surely can't have been to do with the boat.
Well, the horizontal level would have varied, which is why we find different strata exposed. I don't know how high it would have gone, but does this work? No. Does it?
Yeah.
It does. I don't know how high it would have gone. Yeah. It would have certainly varied, because some years you had high inundation and some years you had low. And it would have changed. How high it would have gone, I don't know. But not all of the erosion of the rump would have been caused by water.
Right, fine.
Because the prevailing wind is coming from that direction. So it's high enough to be exposed to the wind, where down below wasn't.
So you're happy that that particular erosion could be wind erosion rather than water?
Yes, there's no indication that that was water erosion. I don't think it would have been up to the neck.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, to me, the pores must have been visible, except at extra time of flooding.
It had to be deep enough for it to be a genuine moat and for you to get around it in a boat. Everybody knows everything they want to know?
A question back here. In a photo in the earlier part of the presentation, I think I saw the word boat next to one of the pyramids. Was there a boat buried next to a pyramid? And if so, was that possibly the one that was in the moat?
Yes, there is a boat. In fact, just to the right of the Sphinx's head, you can see a white object at the base of the southern base of the Great Pyramid, which is a museum which contains what they call the boat beneath the pyramid, which was excavated, and it's made of wood, and it's very amazing. But that was far too enormous to fit in here. They would have had very small ceremonial boats for this moat. But there were boats buried beside pyramids from the First Dynasty onwards, and there are several. There's another one that's known to be up there that they've never excavated, because as soon as they clear it, the wood begins to rot and everything. So these boats were symbolic of the celestial journeys across the sky, as if the sky were a sea, a celestial sea. I mean, they didn't think it was literally a sea, but they were symbolic of the celestial journey of the soul. And the sun himself traveled in such a solar bark, according to the mythology.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if you were aware of the work of Dr. Paul Laviolette, who uses the Sphinx to decode what he says is at least a 16,000-year anti-cryptographic key that codes for knowledge about why the zodiac was put down. And if you are aware of his work, whether or not there's something within the Sphinx that has something that relates to the zodiac, put simply.
I don't know the man you're referring to or his work, I'm afraid to say, but I will say something about the zodiac. The zodiac, as we now know it, only came into Egypt in the Greek period, what's known as the Hellenistic period, after the death of Alexander the Great, when the Ptolemies were the pharaohs. There was no zodiac as such before that in Egypt, and I've studied ancient Egyptian astronomy a great deal. They had other things, but not the zodiac. And so when people talk about, for instance, the sign of Leo and whatever, that the Sphinx was meant to be looking at and so on, there was no sign of Leo. The 12 signs of the zodiac simply did not exist in Egypt before the 3rd century BC. There was no zodiac. So anybody who tries to extrapolate the Babylonian zodiac in Egypt back earlier is wrong. They're just wrong.
Okay, just one more question.
What about the chambers? How were they able to be accessed if it was filled with water, the moat? First question.
Yes, that's a good question. And the first chap was asking, would the things be flooded? Very important. Well, the one at the back, I'm sure, was done later, because it ceased to be a moat at the end of the Old Kingdom, and it never was a moat again, you see. That's the idea. And the intruded shaft would also be later than the Old Kingdom. So those things would have come later when the water was all gone. It's quite possible that all of those chambers were Old Kingdom, and that none of them existed originally, that they were all knocked out by later people, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, Ptolemaic, and that none of those are really original. Now, that's not to say that there are not original chambers further down, as I believe that there are in this area, that the ones I've discussed, I believe, are probably all later than the original Sphinx, and would have been flooded if they'd been there at the time of the moat. Now, the water levels at Giza are very strange. For instance, much higher up, halfway up that Kefren Causeway, if you go down 150 feet, you come to where I took that picture of the moat. Now, there's no water at all in the Rome tunnel hollow out. It's completely dry. And yet there is water at higher levels near the Sphinx, but there's no water at that lower level. And then you've got water at a higher level, higher up the plateau. You see, the limestone plateau is full of caves, and they're unpredictable. So you get water that's high, you get water that's low, all over the place, and uneven. And I believe the Egyptians were able to know about this. And how did they get that one I showed you the picture of to exactly the right point where that water was fed by some underground spring? How did they know it was there? There must be an adjoining chamber or tunnel, so that they first discovered the spring, they knew its level, and then they dug the Osiris shaft down to that level, knowing in advance that the spring was there, which would flood and fill the canal, they were carving out of the bedrock, and they're letting the water in to flood it. They didn't just dig this 150-foot shaft and by accident discover the water was there. They knew it was going to be there.
They obviously had a data. I think we ought to stop.